welcoming distinguished guests, and importantly, the 1,400 students from our city schools. Welcome on behalf of Newcastle's public, Catholic and independent school communities to the annual Newcastle Combined Schools Anzac service. Thank you for your commitment to attending this service that had to be rescheduled from the 22nd of April 2015 due to the extreme weather experienced in our region. This is the 60th year that Newcastle's 3 school communities have come together to commemorate Anzac Day. It is especially significant as it is the 100th anniversary of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915 and the birth of the Anzac legend. Since its beginning in 1954, more than 57,500 Newcastle school students have attended this service. We wish to acknowledge the following special guests. Lord Mayor of Newcastle, Councillor Nuatali Nellis. Mr Phil Winnie, President of Merewether and Hamilton RSL Sub-Branch. Sharon Clayton, MP, Federal Member for Newcastle. Mr Mark Williams, Acting Chief Executive Officer, Newcastle Permanent Building Society. Mr Michael Leach, Head of Marketing, and Andrew Yost, Company Secretary, Newcastle Permanent Building Society. Mr Mike Slater, Chairman, Barry Lewis, David Shanley and Ross Griffiths, Directors of Newcastle Permanent Building Society. Ms Sarah Hutchins, Representative, Department of Veteran Affairs. James Bridgen, Principal School Leadership, representing Frank Potter, Executive Director, Department of Education and Communities. Mr Gerard Mowbray, Director of Schools, Catholic Schools Office, Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle. Duncan McKenzie, Director of Operations, Newcastle Grammar School, representing Newcastle's independent schools. Mrs Christine Bramble, author of The Sisters of the Valley, First World War Nurses, from the Newcastle and Hunter region. Members of the City of Newcastle's ex-service community. 2015 is the 16th year that this ceremony has been organised by a subcommittee of senior high school students rather than just adults. However, we could not have done it all on our own. We wish to recognise Department of Veteran Affairs, Australian Families of the Military Research and Support Foundation, community volunteers, and our teachers for their support and encouragement. We especially acknowledge the Newcastle Permanent Building Society, who has provided the essential financial support as sponsors for the past 9 years to enable this unique event to continue its proud tradition. We also recognise Merewether and Hamilton RSL Sub-Branch for underwriting this year's service. The student members of the 2015 subcommittee are Cooper Stace and Sandra Callahan from Callahan College, Jesmond campus, Josabel Cardona and Curtis Atkin from Merewether High School, Toby Noon and Beatrice Wardhall from Newcastle Grammar School, Chelsea Gilbert and Jared Clarkson from St Francis Xavier College, Hamilton. Our aim is to give you, our fellow students, a greater understanding of why we commemorate Anzac Day, and also to highlight an important part of Australia's identity and military heritage. This service encourages you to remember significant events from Australia's past and how that influences the present and shapes the future.
Anzac Day traditionally commemorates the sacrifice of members of the Australian and New Zealand Armed Forces who have served and those who died in all wars and peacekeeping operations. It is held on the anniversary of the landing by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli in Turkey 100 years ago on the 25th of April 1915. Since Australia became a nation in 1901, hundreds of thousands of Australian men and women have served our country in times of conflict, both in uniform as members of the Australian Navy, Army or Air Force, and as civilians in support roles, such as the Merchant Navy or workers in the factories and on farms. Members of the Australian Armed Forces have and are serving in war zones throughout the world and in Australia, mainly in training and defensive roles. More than 100,000 Australians have died for their country as members of our armed forces, and many more were wounded. Some were held as prisoners of war. War veterans live amongst us in our community, even though we may not know who they are. They look like any Australian. Some are young, particularly those returning from the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, or peacekeeping operations in the Solomon Islands and East Timor. Sadly, 2 Australian servicemen died in both East Timor and Iraq. 41 members of the Australian Defence Force have been killed and 261 wounded in Afghanistan. The Australian Defence Force currently has approximately 2,750 members deployed to more than 14 overseas operations and within Australia to protect Australia and its national interests. Of these, approximately 500 ADS personnel are protecting Australia's borders and maritime interests. Some are middle-aged, such as the men and women who served during the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s to early 1970s. Others who served in the Korean War in the 1950s are much older. Their average age is 79 years. The oldest group of veterans in our community, with an average age of 90 years, are those who served during the Second World War between 1939 and 1945. Unfortunately, all of our World War I veterans who fought on the battlefields of Gallipoli, Palestine, France and Belgium from 1914 to 1918 are no longer with us. Their average age would be over 100 years.
In 1914, a series of political tensions in Europe led to the 2 great sets of alliances: Britain, France, Russia, and the Germany, Austro-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire going to war. At the outbreak of the war, the Australian government announced that, as Great Britain was at war against Germany, automatically so was Australia. Many Australians responded enthusiastically, and a volunteer army of 20,000 was quickly raised. Approximately 10,000 men from the Hunter region signed up during the course of the war to fight with the 1st Australian Imperial Force to assist Britain and France fight against Germany and the Central Powers. But it wasn't only men who enlisted. About 2,500 trained and registered nurses enlisted in the Australian Army Nursing Service and worked in hospitals and on hospital ships and trains, or in casualty clearing stations closer to the front line. Another 700 Australian women served in the British Army and other Allied units. To enlist in the Australian Army Nursing Service, women had to be between 21 and 40 years of age, unmarried, and have completed 3 years of approved hospital training. At the time, nursing and teaching were the only socially acceptable career options for women from middle-class homes. So the competition for places in training hospitals meant that only the best, most intelligent, capable and motivated girls were accepted. These were the girls who today would shine in the highest school certificate and would aspire to study in medicine or law as well as nursing. This was also a time when travelling overseas took many months and was very expensive. So for these ladies, it was an opportunity to see the world. Many also had brothers or relatives already enlisted. Approximately 80 nurses from the Hunter region enlisted in the Australian Army Nursing Service or other allied services. One of these local nurses was 28 years old.
Emily Barrow Henson from Mayfield.
She and several other Hunter Valley nurses.
Edith Rush, Port Stephens.
Blanche Prestwick from Newcastle.
Catherine Lily Doyle
From Singleton.
Emily Taylor, West Maitland.
Embarked from Australia on the 15th of May 1915 on the ship Moulton as part of the Australian Army Nursing Service and then the No. 3 Australian General Hospital, except for Blanche Creswick, who
was sent to Egypt with No. 1 Australian General Hospital.
The camaraderie and atmosphere amongst the ship was immense. For the nurses, seeing places they had only read or heard about and attending the war was a once-in-a-lifetime travelling experience not to be missed. 81 of the No. 3 Australian General Hospital were on board, among medical staff. Among them were a few native French speakers, and according to the nurses on board, learning French was all the rage.
Can you teach us French? Ah bien sûr, je peux faire ça.
Oh, boys, it's not the best end in the world.
I cannot wait to get to Egypt.
I hope we get to see the pyramids.
My brother's serving in the 2nd Battalion. I hope he's well. He will be.
I'm excited to help the men at war.
Good evening, ladies.
I'm terribly excited.
What an adventure!
In a little more than 5 weeks, they arrived in
London!
and enjoyed being tourists, socialising, and the occasional affairs of the heart.
Today I received flowers from Harry. I got 4 letters from my love.
There's so many strapping young men.
In early August, they were sent to
Egypt!
and seeing the Great Pyramids was an exciting experience that few Australian nurses would ever forget.
In the early days of August 1915, the 3rd Australian General Hospital arrived in Lemnos, a site so close to the Gallipoli Peninsula, the nurses could hear the exchange of artillery fire. Lemnos was a barren Greek island where an Allied military base was making preparations for an offensive against the Turkish army. The 3rd Australian General Hospital was one of several hospitals established on the island. Arriving at her home for the next few months, Beryl was disgusted by the
Appallingly bare and ugly island.
Accompanied by a bagpiper, the nurses were marched to their accommodation on the island, a row of tents flapping in the wind, to spend their first night. Only 12 hours later, over 200 wounded and sick men arrived at the hospital from the battles at Gallipoli. Urgent medical treatment was needed for hundreds of different horrific injuries. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel, shelling. Without even a day to settle into their new lives, the nurses were confronted with the terror of war.
We have practically nothing for the patients. Not enough tents and only a few mattresses for the worst cases.
After a week, the nurses were caring for over 1,000 men, and their supplies, due to arrive on another ship, had not yet been delivered. Their overseas adventure had become the reality of Gallipoli.
The nurses had to be decisive and quick-thinking when providing treatment, cleaning wounds, and tending to minor surgeries. They were often forced to improvise, using whatever supplies and equipment they had. They also had to be physically strong and able to endure extremely hard workloads with little help from others. They were also at risk of contracting contagious diseases, such as influenza from the sick soldiers. The nurses suffered many of the same hardships as the soldiers. The harsh, foreign climate, inadequate basic necessities, and stomach upsets were all endured by the female nurses, and many also experienced depression and nightmares.
Found 150 patients lying on the floor.
No equipment, whatever.
No water to drink or wash.
A convoy arrived, about 400.
A good many died. It is just too awful.
The Ascot, its supplies lost, carried everything the nurses desperately needed to survive. Food, medical supplies, and tents. The matron of the hospital, Grace Wilson, rallied to have the supplies found, but she was not listened to among the officers who did not respect her authority. The nurses soon resorted to ripping their petticoats to bandage the men, only able to supply 1 sip of water to each soldier.
Everything was rationed. The food was only what the island could provide.
Nothing but melons and miserable grapes.
And a few doubtful eggs.
Filey, sour bread.
Boiled rice, stale bacon,
Marmalade.
And tea with a suspicion of condensed milk? Us nurses were forced to dine on square biscuits, nicknamed
Dentist friends.
for their uncanny ability to break teeth. Officers, on the other hand,
We dined on thick, fresh bread.
Finally, supplies were found. Abandoned in an old Egyptian warehouse. Stolen by a man wishing to sell them on the black market. When the supplies finally reached Lemnos, the nurses celebrated the influx of equipment, and hospitals began to grow, with new tents springing up like mushrooms, and better food became available.
All sorts of tin stuff.
margarine,
Vegetables. Fresh fruit. We have sausages.
And jam! In Gallipoli, some of the nurses worked aboard hospital ships and had to spend a large portion of their time at sea. Staff nurse Emily Taylor from Maitland was one of the few hunter women who got within sight of Anzac Cove.
We were busy late last night, getting our dressings ready, and we have been up since 5 o'clock this morning, padding splints and getting ready. When we reached Gallipoli, the wounded were lying on the beach in the hot sun, and we had to wait hours to pick them up as we were being bombarded by Turkish shelling. I was terrified. The air vibrated and there was a continual booming. Close enough to see the white trenches of on graves of Allied troops. Trenches, dugouts, and occasionally men. On the trip back, we had 250 patients, and only one orderly.
As the seasons changed, November became a month frozen by the Greek winter. The temperature dropped rapidly, the wind of the island increased, and some of the nurses described the constant collapsing of the tents. They were freezing in their uniforms, now ragged from months of constant wear. When provided with new clothing, anything that could be found to keep them warm, in the freezing conditions, they were dismayed at their appearance.
Yesterday, we got cardigan jackets,
overcoats, Tommies,
and putties.
We looked awful sights.
We all suffered terribly from the cold, and even by wearing all our warm clothing, we couldn't get warm, day or night. I have chilblains on my 2 small toes, frostbitten.
Troops arrived from the front, frostbitten and frozen in the conditions. By December, the men were beginning to be evacuated from Gallipoli. The campaign was coming to a close. The nurses had treated over 7,400 men at No. 3 Australian General Hospital. However, only 143 had died, a true testament to the strength and care of the nurses. On the 17th of January, the nurses sailed out of the harbour, bound for Egypt.
We have just seen the last of Lemnos, and of course we are glad, yet there are many things we will miss. The unconventional freedom and the unique experiences we had here. Goodbye, Lemnos. We take away many happy memories of you, and although I would not have liked to have missed you, I have no desire to see you again.
After the withdrawal of Gallipoli, some Australian forces were sent to Egypt. Most were sent to the Western Front, in France and Belgium, where the war was being fought against the Germans.
War equals injuries, injuries equal hospitals. In World War I, there were casualty clearing stations, which were closest to the front and erected hastily, often beside railway lines. Their role was to provide emergency treatment to wounded soldiers, yet were sometimes subject to attack.
We had less than half an hour's warning to leave with wounded soldiers and pack surgical appliances and stores. Doctors and nurses worked heroically, even though other hospitals in the vicinity were being deliberately bombed.
General hospitals were set up out of the way of enemy fire. Similar to large town hospitals, they dealt with physical injuries, shell shock, disease, fractures, and soldiers who were gassed.
The wounds are usually very septic when they get hit from lying in the trenches, but they clear up wonderfully well. Shrapnel, bullets, bits of shell, and khaki are extracted under anaesthetic and kept as souvenirs by the men.
Auxiliary hospitals handled convalescent or long-term patients and amputees, soldiers who had lost, for example, an arm or a leg.
I was on duty in a ward with 15 patients who had only 3 legs between them. I felt a coward and shrank from meeting them at first, but they shamed me with their cheeriness and independence.
Convalescent and command depots were for the men who no longer needed the care and attention of being in a hospital, but were not yet fit to rejoin their mates and fellow soldiers.
He was only 18. He had
3 missing fingers.
a portion of his
Forefinger.
has a wound on the
Wrist.
a stiff right
Elbow.
knee, crossed bones, and missing
Front teeth.
The
The boys called him Fragments.
The majority of hospitals during World War I were established in civilian buildings, such as hotels, casinos, mansions, warehouses, and clubs. Almost any available building was transformed into one kind of hospital. Even a theme park in Cairo was temporarily converted into a hospital, with the ticket box converted into a surgical ward. Other hospitals were made out of the bare minimum of a few tin sheds, huts, and small tents.
Blanche Quesrick from Newcastle was an experienced nurse stationed at Rouen, which is a little over 100 kilometres from the battlefield of the Somme. She could hear the continual sounds of gunfire from her station. Blanche served during the 5 months that the battle raged to the northeast, and then during the terrible winter of 1916 to 1917. The Somme was part of a British offensive aimed at exacting maximum German casualties and diverting their attention from Verdun. However, Allied forces sustained even more casualties than the Germans. In total, over 1 million men from both sides were killed, missing, wounded, or imprisoned. With patients coming directly from the front line, the stress of the experience was overwhelming. Winter at the Somme was one of the most challenging times, with one of the most severe winters on record. The 12 hunter nurses stationed in the casualty clearing stations in France and in Belgium became used to moving at very short notice in order to avoid the movement of the battlefront. But despite the humanitarian purpose of these military hospitals, the Red Cross flag that waved atop the tents by no means granted them immunity from bombardment.
Beryl Henson stayed with the No. 3 Australian General Hospital until July 1917, when she was assigned to the No. 25 British General Hospital in northern France. There, R. Marshall from the Scottish Black Watch wrote a poem dedicated to her.
some prescribed remedy and write down his last dying message to some loved ones far over the sea. You may hear some delirious ravings and some for the unhammered past, but believe me, my dear sister Anzac, I'll bless you, my Red Cross nurse. I'll bless you, my Red Cross nurse.
November 11, 1918. The armistice was signed. World War I had ended. After the armistice, patients and staff were progressively transported to England in preparation for their return to Australia. For the nurses who had endured the final months of 1915 on Lemnos, there was a feeling of nostalgia for the camaraderie and teamwork that had been built over the previous 4 years. Australian Army nurses served in locations from Britain to India, taking in France and Belgium, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Many of them were decorated, with 8 receiving the Military Medal for Bravery. 25 died during their service. Beryl Henson, Blanche Creswick, Kathleen Doyle, Emily Taylor, and Edith Rush all received the 1914-15 Star, British War Medal, and Victory Medal. Blanche Creswick and Edith Rush both received the Royal Red Cross second class. Blanche Creswick's memorial, a drinking fountain, can be found at Newcastle Private Hospital, New Lambton, the site of the original New Lambton Convalescent Hospital. All the nurses had varying experiences throughout the war, from working on the hospital ship Dunluce Castle to serving in England. Between 1919 and 1920, they finally returned to Australia, where some married and others continued to work as sisters and nurses in various different hospitals. We welcome to the stage Anne Young, a nursing veteran from the Vietnam War, as a representative for all the Newcastle and Hunter nurses who have served during times of war and conflict.
You will be aware of the cadets in uniform standing on the stage, but you may not know why they are here. I call upon the Guard Commander, Sergeant Jacob Reed of the Service and Adventure Training Unit at Newcastle Grammar School, to explain the role of the cadets in today's ceremony.
You may have noticed the 7 people in Army uniforms on the stage. They are cadets from the Service and Adventure Training Unit at Newcastle Grammar School. You might be wondering what they are doing. These 4 people and I are members of what the armed services call a catafalque party. Traditionally, a catafalque party is a raised structure upon which a coffin is placed for display before burial. A catafalque may also be used in ceremonial services, like today, and Anzac Day, as a shrine of remembrance. 4 armed sentries guarded as a sign of respect. The hands symbolize rifles. When a soldier fell during an attack, His mate would pick up the rifle and stick it by the bayonet in the ground, upside down, to ensure the tanks would not accidentally run him over. There are also 2 flag orderlies on the stage that will lower and raise the flags.
We now come to the time in the ceremony when the traditional elements of the Anzac service are performed. The first is the laying of tributes. Flowers have traditionally been laid on graves and memorials in memory of the dead. Wreaths, as a symbol of honour, are also used. Sometimes books are presented as tributes and are later given to libraries. Instead of wreaths or book tributes, single red poppies, also known as the flower of remembrance, will be placed on the cenotaph, draped in the Australian flag, in memory of those who sacrificed their health, their strength, and even their lives that we might live in a free country. While the tributes are being laid, a bagpiper will play a special Scottish tune for mourning and remembrance called the Lament. The bagpiper is Peter Campbell, retired principal of Waratah Primary School and pipe major of the City of Newcastle RSL Pipe Band.
I invite the Lord Mayor, Councillor Newcastle Nelms, to lay the first tribute on behalf of the citizens of Newcastle. Mr. Phil Winnie, representing Meriwether Hamilton, RSL Sub-Branch, on behalf of the Newcastle ex-service community. Sharon Clayton, MP, Federal Member for Newcastle. Mr. Mark Williams, on behalf of sponsors, the Newcastle Permanent Building Society. Mr. Mike Slater, Chairman, Newcastle Permanent Building Society. Mrs. Christine Bramble, author of Sisters of the Valley, World War I nurses from the Hunter Valley. Miss Sarah Hutchins, on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Able Seaman Riley Adlington, representing the Royal Australian Navy, attached to the Joint Warfare Unit, RAAF Base, Williamtown. Able Seaman Adlington is 22 years old. With Corporal Haran Saramento, representing the Australian Army, serves in the 8th Engineer Regiment based at Adamstown. Corporal Sarmiento is 25 years old. With Aircraft Woman Madeline Thies, representing the Royal Australian Air Force, serves in the Expeditionary Health Squadron, based at the RAAF Base, Williamtown. Aircraftswoman Thies is 18 years old. Mr. James Bridgen, on behalf of the Department of Education and Communities, Hunter Region. With Mr. Gerard Mowbray, on behalf of Catholic Schools Office, Maitland Newcastle Diocese. And Mr. Duncan Mackenzie, on behalf of Newcastle's Independent Schools.
The next part of the ceremony is the reading of the Ode of Remembrance. This is a verse taken from a longer poem called For the Fallen by Lawrence Binyon. It was selected in 1919 to unveil a monument in London. Australians present thought it was so good they would use it at their remembrance ceremonies at home. Please listen to the words carefully. Matthew Arnold and Megan Ruitt, Year 6 students and captains at Hamilton South Public School, will read the Ode of Remembrance. We will all respond at the end of the reading by saying the words, lest we forget. Would you all please stand?
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe.
They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we'll remember them. Lest we forget.
Please be seated. We will now hear the last post. The last post is played with a bugle and marks the end of a soldier's day. The last post has been incorporated into funeral and memorial services as a farewell. It symbolises that the duty of the dead is over and that they can rest in peace. The bugle we are about to hear is very special. It was played at Gallipoli and throughout World War I and in New Guinea during World War II. The bugle is now a prized possession of the Friends of the 2nd Infantry Battalion Association and is used at many important ceremonial occasions in the Newcastle area. The bugler is Julius Roberts from Newcastle Grammar School. During the last post, the Australian and New Zealand flags will be lowered to half-mast. The Australian and New Zealand flags are very similar. Both have the Union Jack in the top corner, but the Australian flag has 6 white stars and the New Zealand flag has 4 red stars with white borders. Please stand.
Now, the last vote.
Please bow your heads so that we can have 1 minute silence. This is a sign of respect to those who gave their lives for our country and to think about why we are here. Look towards the flagpoles. In a moment, you will see the flags being raised to the mastheads. While this is being done, the bugler will play Reveille, which is a get-up call. It symbolises an awakening of a better world.
Please remain standing and join the St Francis Xavier Choir, led by conductor Luke Baker, to sing the second verse of the New Zealand National Anthem, followed by the first verse of the Australian National Anthem, presented by members of the Hunter Wind Ensemble and Harrison Crook. The words are printed in the program. Please remain standing for the departure of the catafalque party. I invite Mr. Mark Williams, Acting Chief Executive Officer, Newcastle Permanent Building Society, to speak on behalf of the sponsors of today's service.
Lord Mayor, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honour to represent Newcastle Permanent here today as the Newcastle Combined Schools Anzac service marks its 60th anniversary and we commemorate the centenary of the Anzac landing at Gallipoli. Joining me here today is our Chairman, Michael Slater, Directors Barry Lewis, David Shanley and Ross Griffiths, our Company Secretary and General Counsel, Andrew Yost, our Head of Marketing, Michael Leach, and members of our sponsorship team. The Combined Schools Anzac service has become a time-honoured tradition which enables students to learn about the heritage of our Anzacs whilst also providing them with an opportunity to be involved in the research, development and production of the annual service. And that is why the Combined Schools Anzac service is such a wonderful initiative, providing a platform for learning through researching the incredible stories and the feats of courage and endurance that are such an important part of Australia's rich history. The standard of the production is always very high, and once again the students involved have delivered a very professional and very moving service. You have done your schools and your community proud, and without getting carried away, I think you have also done your generation proud today. You are according a respect to people who have made extraordinary sacrifices, in many cases with their lives, to preserve the freedoms, opportunities and the way of life that we all enjoy here in Australia. We are very proud to have supported the Combined Schools Anzac service for 12 years, helping it become a treasured local tradition and important educational initiative for younger generations. As a customer-owned financial institution, people come first, and the benefits of Newcastle Permanent's financial strength are returned to members and the communities. Our commitment to the communities in which we are part of is something that we are very proud of and enables us to support initiatives such as this. Congratulations to all of the students involved in today's service. Whether you are performing on stage or working behind the scenes, you have all contributed to the service in an important way. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the organising committee, Newcastle and Hunter Combined Schools Anzac Service Incorporated, for dedicating their time and knowledge to assist the students with this service. Thank you to everyone involved today for all your hard work in bringing these stories to life, ensuring that the memory of the Anzacs lives on for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mark Williams. I invite Mr. Phil Winnie, President of Merriweather and Hamilton RSL Sub-Branch, to speak on behalf of the ex-service community.
I've actually come to full circle from being a primary school student at the Junction Demonstration School back in the 50s, when I attended combined school services in Civic Park. They were held over in Civic Park across the road here. Then at the age of 20, I was called up into the Australian Army as a national serviceman and went on to serve in the Vietnam War in 1969. Since then, I've been an active member of committees responsible for the organising of Anzac Day events here in Newcastle. Highlights of that have included being part of the small team that relocated the Newcastle dawn service from Civic Park to Nobby's Beach, at which this year I do believe they had something like 43,000 people. Makes us very proud of that one. We also moved the Combined Schools Anzac service from Civic Park, where it used to be held outdoors, and quite often in rainy conditions, where we moved it indoors into the City Hall, which it quickly outgrew, and we've then had to move it here into the Civic Theatre. Both of these initiatives have been milestones in the development of this city's commemoration of Anzac Day. The Merriweather Hamilton RSL sub-branch is very pleased this year to underwrite the cost of producing the 2015 service, which importantly has enabled it to be held in the centenary year of Anzac. I acknowledge and I do thank and congratulate the Newcastle Permanent Building Society for the contribution as principal corporate sponsor of the Newcastle Combined Schools Anzac service for so many years. I'd also like to recognise the Newcastle Permanent Building Society former chairman and current director, Barry Lewis, AM, who was instrumental in initially gaining the firm support for this event. Each year about 1,400 Newcastle students leave the Civic Theatre with newfound knowledge and understanding about how and why we remember and commemorate Australia's rich military heritage, focusing on men and women from the Hunter. This knowledge is then shared by those 1,400 students with the wider community, and I am very proud and honoured to be part of this hopefully ongoing educational and leadership opportunity for our children. As a veteran, I value this event very highly. Finally, I wish to congratulate a dedicated team of highly motivated people who are true believers in this event and who have overcome significant obstacles to again produce a special commemorative event. Thank you.
Clayton, MP, Federal Member for Newcastle.
Thank you. It's such a tremendous honour to be here to share in this really important commemorative service. I certainly look forward to sharing the stories of today's service with the Australian Parliament when I return to Canberra next week. One of the great hopes of the Parliament was that local communities all across Australia would be able to commemorate this important centenary milestone for Anzac in ways that were meaningful and rang true to our local communities. And I absolutely pay tribute to all of the schools, the teachers, parents, friends and families, everybody who has been involved in today's service for the portrayal of the Australian nurses and their contribution to Anzac. I think is a terribly important story that absolutely deserves being, shone a big spotlight on so that we all know that story. And I think it's one that hasn't been told very often in Australia. So I really pay tribute to the schools today for making that a focus of today's program, and thank all the people that played such a critical role in that. And certainly our sincere thanks go to the ex-service community, the Newcastle Permanent, and everybody that has made a contribution today to making this service such a tremendous success. Thank you very much for the honour of being able to share in that occasion with you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sharon Clayton. I invite the Lord Mayor, Councillor Nuatali Nelms, to speak on behalf of the people of the City of Newcastle.
Thank you. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on the traditional lands of the Awabakala Warramai peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and any Indigenous persons here today. It does give me great pleasure to be with you on the 60th year of the Combined Schools Anzac service. And like the speakers before me, I am truly blown away of the level of professionalism and the dedication to this remembrance service from all the schools involved. It was wonderful to see, as the federal member said, the nurses being recognised for their contribution during World War I. And I acknowledge Christine Bramble's book of the local nurses in this Hunter region. And the wonderful thing about this service is it does shine a light on locals in the Hunter and Newcastle and the work and the contribution they have made to protecting this country. It was a great pleasure of mine to give an address at the dawn service to 43,000 people, the biggest dawn service we've ever had in Newcastle. And as Mr. Winnie said, it was a decision many years ago to move the service to an area that could accommodate that many people. It was wonderful to see the community, after such a devastating week of storms, come out to embrace remembrance. And you probably hear as students discussions around remembering and commemorating and about war. But you can see today by the performance on stage that those young men and women went off seeking adventure. But what they actually got when they arrived in Europe and on the Gallipoli Peninsula and on Lemnos was anything but a fun adventure. It was a very, very difficult time when many thousands of lives were lost, many Australian lives, and there were many women supporting those men at that time with medical services. And you can see why we remember. And that war might have been fought in Europe, but in World War II, Newcastle, and not many students might remember this or know this, we were actually shelled by Japanese submarines on the 8th of June in 1942. So the war did come to Newcastle, and there are marks in our road, and there are the shells that landed in this city up at Fort Scratchley, and there's a wonderful World War I exhibition up there if you'd like to go up with your school or with your family. It's open for most of the rest of this year. And the artefacts that are collected up there are very particular not only to World War I but also to World War II and other significant events that have affected this country. So it is my great pleasure to speak on behalf of the citizens to say thank you to the teachers, for bringing the students to this service every year so they can learn and acknowledge the fight that we've had to protect our secular democracy in this country, which I believe is very important and worth protecting. And I also believe that we would be less engaged in conflict overseas if more countries had secular democracies like we live in Australia. So thank you very much, and I look forward to celebrating again with you next year.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Lord Mayor, distinguished guests and fellow students, this concludes the 2015 Newcastle Combined Schools Anzac service. Thank you for joining us for this special Anzac commemoration.